My parents gave their dream house as a wedding gift to my sister, but I had been the one paying the mortgage for 5 years. 2 months later, they decided they wanted to move into my vacation home. I refused. Then, I received a call from the police. My husband Owen and I arrived at my sister Zoe's wedding venue. In Owen's jacket pocket was an envelope containing $10,000, our wedding gift to her. On top of that, we had already covered about a third of the wedding costs. It was a lot of money, but with Owen's job at an investment bank and my position as a marketing director, we could afford it. After all, Zoe was my only sibling. As we walked in, I immediately spotted my parents. My mom was adjusting my dad's tie while he pretended to be annoyed, though a smile tugged at the corners of his lips. They looked radiant. There was no other word to describe it. My mom's face glowed with happiness, and my dad appeared 10 years younger. Something twisted in my stomach. I couldn't recall seeing them this happy at my own wedding 5 years earlier. Back then, they were kind, yes, but not like this. Overflowing with pride and joy. I quickly shook off those thoughts. This wasn't the time to dwell on old feelings. The ceremony was perfect. Zoe looked stunning in her dress, and her now husband, Mason, couldn't take his eyes off her. I sat between my parents and Owen, trying to focus on the joy of the moment, but that nagging feeling persisted. Their reactions felt so different from how they acted during my wedding. After the ceremony came the reception. We ate, drank, danced, and then it was time for speeches. First the best man, then the maid of honor, and finally my parents stood up together. My mom gently tapped her glass. "We want to thank everyone for being here today to celebrate the marriage of our beloved daughter." There was something about the way she emphasized beloved that made me shift uncomfortably in my seat. Owen must have noticed because he placed his hand over mine. My dad continued. "Watching Zoe grow into the incredible woman she is today has been the greatest joy of our lives. She's always been special, bringing so much light into our home." I smiled and nodded, wondering if I was being too sensitive. Of course they loved Zoe. They loved me too, right? Then, my mom reached into her bag and pulled out some papers. "Mason, Zoe, your father and I wanted to give you something to start this new chapter together. Something truly meaningful." She held up the papers for everyone to see. "We're gifting you our family home as a wedding present." The room erupted in gasps of surprise, followed by enthusiastic applause. I froze. Beside me, Owen tensed up. I stared at my parents, then at Zoe, hoping someone would laugh and say it was a joke. But no. My parents beamed with pride, and Zoe didn't look surprised at all. She cried tears of joy, hugging Mason, who gaped at my parents in disbelief. That house. The house I'd been paying the mortgage on for 5 years because my parents could no longer afford it due to Dad's overtime and Mom's arthritis making full-time work impossible, now belonged to Zoe. I managed to force a smile, but inside, I was screaming. Not once had they mentioned plans to give the house to Zoe. Not once did they ask me, even though I'd been shouldering the financial burden. "You okay?" Owen whispered. "Yes," I replied through gritted teeth, still smiling, as Zoe and Mason headed to the stage to hug my parents. An hour later, I couldn't take it anymore. I found Owen at the bar. "Can we go?" I asked softly. He looked into my eyes and nodded. "I'll grab our coats." We made up an excuse. "Owen has an early meeting tomorrow. Congratulations again, it was a beautiful wedding." And we left before anyone could protest further. As soon as we got into the car, I burst into tears. "I can't believe they did that," I sobbed as Owen started the engine. "I've been paying that mortgage for 5 years, and they never even told me they planned to do this." "I know," said Owen solemnly. "It's unbelievable. And did you see Zoe's expression? She wasn't surprised at all." Everly wiped her eyes angrily. "It's not about the money. I don't care about that. But they could have warned me beforehand." As we walked home, memories kept flooding back. The countless times my parents had clearly favored Zoe. Do you remember when I graduated and they gave me a $50 gift card? But 2 years later, when Zoe graduated, they bought her a car. That was unfair, Owen agreed. And my 21st birthday party, which they completely skipped because Zoe had a volleyball game. Just a regular match. It wasn't even a championship or anything important. The more I spoke, the more examples came to mind. Every time Zoe got everything she wanted while I was ignored or forgotten. Like how they attended all of Zoe's events, but always found excuses to miss mine. How they bragged about Zoe's achievements but barely mentioned mine. When we got home, I was exhausted from crying and talking so much. Where are your parents going to live now? Owen asked as we got ready for bed. If they gave the house to Zoe and Mason, I shrugged while changing into my pajamas. I don't know. It's no longer my problem. I turned off the light and lay down, trying to ignore the ache in my chest. Over the next 3 weeks, I stuck to my routine. Work, coming home, and trying not to think about the wedding, the house, or anything related to it. Then one afternoon, my phone rang. It was my mom. Against my better judgment, I answered. Everly, sweetheart, Mom chirped as if nothing had happened. We're having a family dinner this weekend. Your sister and Mason are back from their honeymoon, and we'd love for you and Owen to join us. A small, foolish, hopeful part of me wondered if they might apologize or explain themselves. Fine, I replied curtly. We'll be there on Saturday. Saturday arrived too quickly. When we pulled up, I noticed Zoe's car in the driveway along with my parents' old sedan. We approached the front door, and I hesitated before ringing the bell. It felt strange not to use my key, but this house wasn't my parents' anymore. It belonged to Zoe and Mason now. Mom greeted us warmly, all smiles. Everly, Owen, come in, come in. She hugged me tightly, as if nothing was wrong, as if she hadn't handed over the house I'd helped pay for without telling me. I returned, the hug stiffly. Dad was in the living room with Mason, watching a game. He stood up when we entered, shaking Owen's hand firmly and giving me a quick hug. Where's Zoe? I asked, noticing her absence. Oh, she's changing the curtains in the dining room, Mom said casually. She spent the whole week redecorating. My blood boiled. 3 weeks after the wedding, and Zoe was already making changes as if she'd owned the place for years. We went to the dining room, and there was my sister, perched on a ladder, hanging beige curtains instead of Mom's old blue ones. Dinner's ready, Mom announced. We took our seats. I sat between Owen and Dad, with Mom and Zoe across from us, and Mason at the head of the table. The food looked delicious, Mom's special roast with all the trimmings. But I wasn't hungry. The first 10 minutes were filled with Zoe and Mason recounting their honeymoon in Hawaii. I pushed my food around my plate and nodded occasionally while Owen politely asked questions to keep the conversation going. Finally, when Zoe paused to take a breath, Mom cleared her throat. So, we wanted to talk to you about something, Everly, she began. As you know, we gave the house to Zoe and Mason as a wedding gift. Yeah, I noticed, I replied dryly. Mom continued as if she hadn't detected the sarcasm in my voice. The thing is, they're a young couple starting their life together. They need their own space. I stayed silent, waiting for her to get to the point. Dad shifted, uncomfortably in his seat. What your mother is trying to say, he interjected, is that we can't live here with them. They need privacy. I understand, I said, still unsure where this was heading. So where do you plan to live, Mom and Dad? They exchanged another glance. I noticed Zoe suddenly becoming very interested in her mashed potatoes. Well, began Mom, carefully choosing her words. We've thought long and hard about it, and we've decided to move into your vacation home. It's the perfect size for us, and it's in such a peaceful, lovely neighborhood. I set my silverware down gently on my plate. That so-called vacation home was actually a small cabin I had purchased entirely with my own money years before meeting Owen. I'd saved up for ages to afford it. It was my personal sanctuary, a place where I could escape the chaos of city life. Occasionally, I let my parents use it for a weekend getaway. Let me get this straight, I said, keeping my voice calm but firm. You gave away the house, the one I paid the mortgage on for 5 years, to Zoe. And now you're planning to move into my vacation home without even asking me first? Everly, Dad interjected, frowning. Be reasonable. Where do you expect us to go? That's no longer my problem, I replied firmly. You had a house and gave it away as a gift without consulting the person who was paying for it. Now you just assume you can take something that belongs to me? It doesn't work like that. You hardly ever. Use it anyway, Zoe chimed in, inserting herself into the conversation. I turned to her, unable to hide my irritation. Are you serious right now? It's my property. I bought it with my money. I decide who uses it and when. Mom's face paled. You can't mean that. Are you really saying you won't let us live there? That's exactly what I'm saying, I responded without hesitation. You're not moving into my vacation home. Not now, not ever. A heavy silence fell over the table. Then Mom erupted. How could you do this to us? After everything we've done for you? We're your parents. Yes, and as my parents, you should have talked to me before giving away a house I was paying for, I shot back. And now you think you can just take something else that's mine? You don't have that right. We have nowhere else to go, Mom insisted, raising her voice. Actually, you do, I countered coldly. You still have the house I paid the mortgage on for 5 years, but you gave it to Zoe, so now it's her responsibility to figure out where you'll stay. Zoe slammed her hand on the table. God, you're so cruel and selfish. You've always been jealous of me because Mom and Dad love me more. You've always envied our relationship. I stared at her, momentarily stunned by her sudden outburst. Then, after a few seconds, I turned back to her, eerily calm. If Mom and Dad love you that much, and if you love them that much, why don't you offer to let them stay here with you? It's a 4-bedroom house. There's plenty of room. Zoe's mouth snapped shut. She quickly looked away, suddenly fascinated by her plate. That's not the point, Mason muttered, trying to intervene. I understand, I replied. You need your privacy, and I need my vacation home. At that moment, my parents started talking all at once, accusing me of being unreasonable, selfish, ungrateful. I stopped listening. I stood up, grabbed my purse, and declared, Owen, I think we're done here. The next day, my phone was flooded with messages and calls from my parents and Zoe. I ignored them all. Some were accusations of selfishness, others were pleas for me to reconsider, and some tried to guilt-trip me by reminding me of everything they supposedly did for me over the years. I showed a few of the texts to Owen, who shook his head in disbelief. I think I need to block them for a while, I murmured. I can't keep reading this. Do what you need to do, he said, kissing the top of my head. Take care of yourself first. That's exactly what I did. I temporarily blocked their numbers and social media accounts. I needed space to process everything that had happened. 2 weeks passed in blissful silence. No calls, no texts, no family drama. Owen and I fell back into our usual routine. Work, home, occasional dinners with friends who, thankfully, didn't try to steal my properties. It was a relief. I was sitting at my desk reviewing a marketing campaign when my phone buzzed with a notification. I glanced down and felt my stomach drop. It was an alert from the security system at my vacation home. Movement detected. Front door opened. I quickly opened the app. Someone had used a key to unlock the front door but hadn't disarmed the alarm. The security company was about to contact me any minute now to confirm whether the entry was authorized. And, as expected, my phone rang almost immediately. Ms. Wilson, this is Scarred Security. We've detected an intrusion at your property on Piney Road. Is this authorized? No, I replied firmly. I'm not there, and no one has permission to be in the house. Please call the police immediately. An hour later, my phone rang again. It was an officer from the local police department. Ms. Wilson, this is Lieutenant Christopher Lee. We're at your property on Piney Road. There are 2 individuals claiming to be your parents. They have keys, but admitted they didn't have permission to be there. I closed my eyes, confirming my suspicions. Yes, those are my parents, but they absolutely do not have permission to be in my house. Understood. How would you like to proceed? We can remove them from the property, But since they used a key instead of breaking in, it creates a gray area regarding potential charges. I'll come, I decided. My husband and I can leave right away. We're about an hour's drive away. The drive was tense. I oscillated between shock and frustration. How could they do this after I'd been so clear that I didn't want them moving in? Who does something like that? When we arrived at my vacation home, a patrol car was parked in front of the entrance. 2 officers were outside, and sitting on the porch steps were my parents, looking miserable. Several suitcases and boxes were stacked beside them. My dad stood up when he saw us. "Everly, thank God you're here. Tell these officers it's all a misunderstanding." I got out of the car and walked over to the officers, ignoring my parents for the moment. "Thank you for responding so quickly. Those are indeed my parents, but they don't have permission to be here." One of the officers nodded. "Ma'am, would you like to press charges for trespassing?" My mom gasped. "Everly, you wouldn't do that." I turned to her. "They entered my house after I explicitly told them they couldn't. What did they think was going to happen?" "But we didn't break in," my dad protested. "We used the key you gave us." "This is all your fault," my mom suddenly shouted, standing up. "If you had let us stay here like we planned, none of this would have happened. We wouldn't be here being treated like criminals." I stared at her, stunned by her anger. "My fault? You gave away a house I paid the mortgage on without even telling me, then tried to take another one of my properties without permission. And somehow, it's my fault?" "You're so arrogant," my mom continued, completely ignoring my point. "Irresponsible too. We gave you an excellent education. We gave you everything." "Mom," I interrupted, my voice low, "you're embarrassing yourself. You and Dad just tried to force your way into my house to move in after I clearly said no. And now you're here, in front of police officers, yelling at me about how irresponsible I am." That seemed to hit her. She snapped her mouth shut, but her eyes were still filled with indignation. I turned back to the officers. "I'd like to speak privately, please." We stepped away from my parents and Owen. "I don't want to press charges against them," I explained quietly. "They're still my parents, even if they're acting absurdly right now. But I can't let them stay here either." The officer nodded. "We understand that family situations can be complicated. We can take them to the station. For a few hours, give them a stern warning for trespassing, and then release them. Sometimes a few hours in a cell can serve as a good lesson." I thought about it. That might be exactly what they needed. "Yes, please, do that." I returned to where my parents were sitting. "The officers are going to take you to the station for a few hours. I'm not pressing charges, but I want you to understand how serious this is. You can't just move into someone's house without permission, even if you're family." The police car with my parents drove off. While we waited for the locksmith, I made arrangements to have their belongings sent to a nearby storage facility. I paid a month in advance and sent the details to my sister, since my parents' numbers were still blocked. The locksmith arrived and changed all the locks. By the time we left, the house was secure once again. On the way back to our apartment, I felt a mix of exhaustion and an odd sense of freedom. For the first time as an adult, I had confronted my parents' manipulation and refused to be taken advantage of. "What do you think they'll do now?" Owen asked as we neared home. "They'll probably cry to Zoe," I guessed. "Let her deal with them. She kept the house, so she can handle the responsibilities that come with it. I'm not naive enough to think this is over, but knowing Mom, she'll find a way to paint me as the villain. That's always her move." I was right. A week later, I opened Facebook and stumbled upon a dramatic post from my mom. It already had dozens of supportive comments from family members and close friends. "Today, I learned what it means to be abandoned by your own child," the post began. "My husband and I, in our golden years, were treated like unwanted animals. Our eldest daughter, Everly, called the police on us and had us removed from her vacation home as if we were common criminals, leaving us with nowhere to go." The post went on, conveniently omitting the fact that they had given my house to Zoe, that I had paid the mortgage for 5 years, and that they had tried to move into my property against my explicit wishes. As I scrolled through the comments, I saw people calling me heartless, cruel, and ungrateful. something inside me snapped. I started drafting my own response. It was time for everyone to hear the full story. I've always stayed silent about family matters, I began. But since my mom has chosen to make our private issues public, I feel compelled to share my side. Here are the details conveniently left out of her post. Over the past 5 years, I've been paying the mortgage on my parents' house because they couldn't afford it due to health issues and reduced work hours. I did this willingly because they're my family and they needed help. 3 weeks ago, at my sister Zoe's wedding, which, by the way, I also helped finance, my parents announced they were giving the house I'd been paying for to my sister as a wedding gift. They did this without consulting me or even warning me. When I finally spoke to them after the wedding, they informed me they planned to move into my vacation home. Again, without asking. Apparently, they had arranged everything with my sister before the wedding. She'd get their house, and they'd take my vacation property. When I opposed their plan to move in, they tried to force their way in, using a spare key I'd given them for emergencies. The security system triggered, which is why the police got involved. Contrary to what my mom's post suggests, I didn't have them arrested. Yes, I asked for them to be removed from the property because they were trespassing. Afterward, I paid to have their belongings stored. If my parents need a place to stay, maybe they should ask my sister, who now owns a 4-bedroom house thanks to them, and to me, since I paid the mortgage on their original home. I added one final paragraph. I've always done my best to help my family, but I won't allow myself to be taken advantage of or painted as the bad guy simply for defending my property after already paying for theirs. Family goes both ways. It's about mutual respect, not just taking what you want because we share blood. I hit post before I could second-guess myself. Owen read over my shoulder and nodded in approval. The response was immediate. Comments began pouring in, from cousins, aunts, uncles, and even some of my parents' friends. But unlike the reactions to my mom's post, these were overwhelmingly supportive. Wow, I had no idea you were paying their mortgage. That's so unfair. Wait, they gave away a house you were paying for? That's insane. I should have felt vindicated, but above all, I just felt tired. The whole situation was exhausting, and making it public didn't exactly feel good, even though I was only defending myself. 2 days later, my cousin Skylar called me. Hey, I just wanted to check in on how you're doing, she said. Your parents tried to go back to their old house, or rather, Zoe's house, now, but she wouldn't let them in. I sat up, surprised. Really? Yeah. Apparently she told them it was her house now, and there was no room for them. Now they're living in a rented apartment, and your mom had to go back to work full-time to cover the rent. I wasn't sure how to feel about that. Part of me thought they deserved it. They had created this mess after all. But another part of me still felt a twinge of compassion. They were still my parents, even if they'd treated me unfairly. After hanging up, I told Owen what Skylar had shared. It's just karma, he commented. Yeah, I agree, I replied. But I don't feel as satisfied as I thought I would. That's because you're a good person, Everly, he said, pulling me closer. Unlike some other people we could mention. In the weeks that followed, my parents tried to reach out to me several times. I saw their names pop up on my phone, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. The wounds were still too fresh. One night, as Owen and I were getting ready for bed, he asked, "Do you think you'll forgive them someday?" "I've thought about it," I replied. "Maybe one day, not for them, but for me. Holding on to all this anger isn't healthy." "And Zoe?" I sighed. "It's more complicated. She knew what they were planning. She was part of it. And then she turned her back on them when they needed her." "At least now you know where you stand," Owen said, hugging me. "No more illusions about who matters to them and who doesn't." He was right. As painful as this experience had been, it had stripped away the masks. For years, I'd tried to earn my parents' approval, striving to be as special to them as Zoe always seemed to be. Now, I knew that would never happen. And strangely, that realization was liberating. The next morning, I saw another missed call from my mom. This time, I let it go to voicemail. Her voice sounded different, more fragile, less commanding. Everly, we made a mistake. A big one. I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. But please call us back. We need to talk. I deleted the message without responding. Maybe someday I'd be ready to hear their apology, if it was sincere. Maybe someday I'd be ready to let them back into my life, but on new terms, with clear boundaries. But not today. Today, I was still learning to put myself first, something I should have done a long time ago. As for my vacation home, I decided to rent it out. The extra income would be helpful, and I liked the idea of the place being used and appreciated instead of sitting empty as a reminder of everything that had happened. What an irony, huh? I spent years trying to be the perfect daughter, only to discover that my greatest accomplishment was learning to say no. They wanted to paint me as the villain, but they wrote the script for this chaos themselves. The vacation home will have new tenants. At least these ones will pay rent. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel, like the video, share it with someone who needs guidance, and stay tuned. The next video is going to surprise you. See you there.